Last four in, first four out. Texas, Xavier, San Diego State, and North Carolina getting into the field. The teams out of the bracket, Indiana, West Virginia, Boise State, and Ohio State. Okay. So we've got some questions, and for more on the bracket, here's Matt Norlander with the chair and the vice chair of the men's basketball committee, Bubba Cunningham and Keith Gill.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining. Appreciate this so much. We're going to start with North Carolina, the last team in the field, and the school where Bubba Cunningham, the chair of this year's men's basketball selection committee, obviously works. Bubba, inform our audience of what the protocols are, what your role was or was not involving Carolina's inclusion into the field, and then at what point, how did you actually discover that UNC was going to be in the field? At what point today in this process did you actually learn that the Tar Heels were going to be the last team in?
Well, thanks, Matt. And you mentioned protocols, but you know what the NCAA committee works on are principles, and the principles cannot be violated. So any athletic director, any conference commissioner that has a team under consideration or being discussed has to leave the room, and we follow that religiously. And so anytime Carolina came up, I left, and obviously our vice chair here, Keith, took over. And so Keith can probably answer your question more adequately or appropriately than I can.
Yeah, thanks, Bubba, and thanks, Matt. Appreciate the question. Appreciate you being here. As Bubba said, as the vice chair, because our protocols require any AD that's in the room to recuse themselves from the conversation around their team, anytime we discussed North Carolina, Bubba had to leave the room. And also any vote that we had related to North Carolina, Bubba could not participate in those votes and was not involved in any of those votes. So we had a lot of discussion about North Carolina, as you can imagine, and we followed that protocol to the letter.
Let's dig in a little bit more here. North Carolina and Xavier each only had one quad one win. There are teams that were left out of the field like West Virginia, Boise State, Indiana. These teams easily outpaced them. From the discussions, take us into the room, gentlemen. And I know, Bubba, you can't with Carolina specifically, but you can with Xavier. What are the talking points that, in both of your opinions, and Bubba, I'll tee up with you to go into Xavier, that led to these teams clearing the field while other teams that had more heft at the top of their resume did not?
Well, I think when you say that, I think you're kind of zeroing in on quad one wins. And what the committee looks at is a whole series of metrics. And we're looking at the ones that we traditionally looked at, both the predictive and the results. This year we added Torvik, we added the WAB. So there's a lot of different opinions. There's certainly 12 different members representing schools and conferences across the country. So the diversity of opinion, I think, is reflected in the teams that were selected. And that's really where I think it came down, is a personal opinion on what's most important to you when you're evaluating a team.
And you mentioned WAB, that's wins above bubble, which is a new metric on the team sheet. Carolina was very, very high among all potential bubble teams. Let's burrow into that metric real quickly here, because our audience learning what has now been added to getting teams into the field and helping select. Did you feel as though, both of you personally, did you put more emphasis on that metric, or did the collective committee have an emphasis on that as it came down to it, where, clearly there were certain things with Carolina, with Xavier and others, where they didn't have it? Did wins above bubble play as important of a role or as prominent a role as any other metric as part of the selection process across the board this year?
Yeah, I think it did. As we said, we had the Torvik and the WAB both added. Both of those are dimensions to the consideration that we haven't had in the past. And so the WAB really is designed, when you get down to trying to compare these teams across the country, how would they compete against the teams around the bubble? And how would they compete against the non-conference schedule that each of the teams that are being considered have played? So it really is, it's an interesting metric that we're using for the first time. And I think we used it, but there's not any singular metric that we all rely on.
Before we get to teams in the field, Keith, I'll tee you up on this. I'm following a ton here in real time, but it seems like you might have said on CBS that Tucker DeVries' injury for West Virginia might have played a factor. I'm curious how and why that would have been the case. This is a player who has not been available for well over half the season. In fact, probably about 75% of the season. We've seen what West Virginia is without him. Why would a player's inavailability play a factor in a team's inclusion or not in the field when we've largely seen what that team is when he isn't available?
Yeah, so we always talk about player availability and how important that is. When you think about two of the best wins that West Virginia had, Arizona and Gonzaga, Tucker DeVries played in those games. Since he's been gone, they were 13-11 since his injury. And so as we're trying to weigh, what teams are and what they're going to be in the tournament, that piece of data is really important as we're trying to get down to it and determine who are the best 37 teams for at-large bursts into the tournament.
All right, let's go into the Michigan Wolverines. They won the Big Ten tournament. They won it on Sunday right before the selection show. They beat Wisconsin. They have 2 wins over Wisconsin, and yet it would appear from the outside looking in like the Big Ten tournament final didn't play a role whatsoever, because Michigan is a 5 despite having the 4th most quad 1 wins. Had the committee determined before this game was even played, regardless of the result, that Michigan was going to be on the 5 line? And if it was, did the SEC's role in having 14 teams into the field, did that play a part in keeping Michigan on the 5?
No, that's always the last tournament that completes. And we had contingency brackets based on Wisconsin winning or based on Michigan winning. And they did get scrubbed up, assuming that they had won in the contingency bracket that we had reviewed. So had Wisconsin won, it would have been a different bracket as well. So, no, that game was important, and it was considered by the entire committee.
I want to get to the SEC,
by the way,
but before
Michigan's
that,
had an outstanding year, and as has the entire Big Ten.
Apologies on that, Bubba. I want to get to the SEC, but before that, I did notice something that's happening here with a couple of these seeds, and I want to know what the committee did in terms of lower-seeded teams getting a little bit less of a trip here. But you've got Louisville as an 8, which came as a surprise. It only has to go down the road to Lexington, and that's what Auburn might have to face there. Typically, if you're seeded 1 to 4, as you gentlemen well know, those teams are usually given geographic preference. Illinois has to make a short trip, relatively speaking, to Milwaukee. There's a few other instances in the bracket with that. Why is this the case? It seems like an abnormal number of teams that aren't seeded 1 through 4 are given a little bit of a geographic leniency, and potentially, a slight crowd advantage there, considering the higher seeded, better seeded teams they could face in the second round.
Yeah, typically all of our brackets are done geographically once we get people seated. But this year, we had the complication with 14 teams in from one league. We've had multiple teams in from other leagues. So trying to move teams around and keep them on the same seed line, we were really trying to be fair to the bracket and do the best that we could, trying to make sure that teams from the same conference don't meet too soon in the tournament. And there's pros and cons to each of those decisions that we make, but we're really trying to spread out the teams from one league to multiple sides of the bracket.
All right, my last one here. Let's talk about the SEC. Keith, I'm going to tee you up first, and then Bubba, you can take it after. I want to hear from both of you to wrap this up. The SEC sets a record with 14 teams in the bracket. 2 parts here. The first being, can you please reveal and give our audience a sense of what needed to be accommodated in order to make this happen to avoid rematches as much as possible? I'd love to know the specific teams and what might have needed to be moved as it pertains to seeding and location. And secondarily, how much, if at all, was the unavoidable fact that the SEC was moving towards setting this record of 14 teams? The previous record was 11, gentlemen. How much of that reality was talked about in the room vis-a-vis as it came down to Texas and whether or not they would get in? It's obviously a huge story heading into play on Tuesday night in the NCAA tournament. Keith, you first.
Yeah, so we didn't talk a whole lot about a record number from the SEC because we look at these as institutions and individual teams. And so we are evaluating individual team records across all those other kind of teams across the country. And so we are doing that all on its merits. And so a conference's number of teams is not something that we really kind of consider in the place. I think in terms of the bracketing and how those things work, we try to make sure across the top 4 seed lines that the top 4 seeds from a conference are in different regions, and that's really important. So obviously we did that across the top with those top 4 SEC teams. And then we also have principles relative to the number of times teams played within a particular season as to when they can meet within the tournament. And so obviously we found those. You'll certainly see some kind of matchups that could happen in the second round that are kind of conference matchups, and that was obviously unavoidable. We certainly did everything we could, but we did that within our bracketing procedures, some of which you have to relax if you have 9 or more teams, and we did certainly the best we could to build the best bracket we could, avoiding those matchups, but sometimes it had to happen.
All right, gentlemen, I appreciate that. Bubba, I wanted to get one thing quick from you, just on the SEC. I mean, from your perspective overall, was this as challenging of an exercise? This is your 5th and final year on the committee. Was it as challenging of a thing that you've had to do since you joined, trying to figure out how to appropriately slot all these SEC teams?
Yeah, it was. That was the hardest bracketing procedure we've had to date. But again, every year, 68 teams, and there's the last 4 in, the first 4 out. And you can feel it in the room. The intensity of those last couple of votes is really taxing on everybody on the committee. And boy, for the teams, I know it's devastating if you don't make it and euphoric if you do. So we take that very, very seriously as we go.
Gentlemen, we appreciate you joining us. Didn't get any one-seed talk because there's not really much debate about those 4, so I know you appreciate that so much. Thank you for joining us. Can't wait to get this wonderful tournament started, and appreciate the answers you could give us. Hakeem, back to you.
Matt, thank you. The madness is here. Don't miss a moment of the action on CBS, TBS, TNT, and True TV. Download the March Madness Live app to watch every game, anywhere, anytime, live.